Thank you very much, Christopher, and it's delighted to be able to talk to you. I think the only thing better than that would be to actually be in Tasmania talking to you face to face. So look, in this era of voluntary assisted dying and euthanasia proposals, I'd like to get for a minute behind the emotion and talk about the more rational arguments about why I believe that in all situations life is preferable to death. We're not death denying, we'll all die, but we want to live life to the full until that time happens. Now, voluntary assisted death used to be called assisted suicide, which is actually what it is. So we don't want to sanitize these terms. We're talking about assisted suicide. Euthanasia refers to active euthanasia. And I just want to talk about one term for the moment because it's used to sort of confuse the situation. And that is when people start talking about passive euthanasia. And what they're trying to confuse is the fact that withdrawing treatment, which has always been allowed if a treatment is no longer working or it's simply a burden and it's not going to make a difference, has always been part of judgment in medicine. But in fact, it is not any form of euthanasia because it's a decision we make when people aren't dying. So in my field, if chemotherapy isn't working, you either go on to something else or try another form of treatment. But at the end of life, it might be if being on a ventilator is not actually going to save your life and yet is a burden, then it's reasonable to withdraw that. And that's not euthanasia at all. And the reason that people try and term passive euthanasia is so that they can claim an inconsistency that if you supported treatment withdrawal, you ought to support euthanasia. But the fact is, when you withdraw a treatment, if someone doesn't die, you don't seek to end their life because you've done what you want to do. You've withdrawn a burden from them, and you've concentrated on palliating their symptoms, and that's what you tend to do at that phase of their treatment. So physicians are not obliged to provide treatments when they're not effective, or in fact they could be harmful. And when giving options to patients, often we talk about whether treatments are going to be helpful or whether they're going to be futile. Now, symptom control is never futile. We ought to be doing that all the time, but some of our active treatments can work for a while and then not work, and that's when we should withdraw them, because there are very few treatments that don't have side effects, and we want to withdraw that and get on with controlling the symptoms of the patient. Now, why value life? Well, we know as Christians, the Judeo-Christian view is human life is valuable because it's given by God and it's valued by God. But in fact, in the philosophical literature, you can reach the same conclusion by completely different types of arguments. And Immanuel Kant said humans have intrinsic worth based on the fact that they were rational and able to make moral decisions. And he suggested that because of that, humans are ends, not means to ends. And so suicide would be using a human as a mean to an end. So the value of life, although we place that value because of God's value on our life, in fact, others have reached other different arguments that come to the same point, that we should put the highest value on life. Now, the essence of euthanasia or voluntary assisted death is that we're making an autonomous decision. But what it actually is meaning is that we're actually putting autonomy, our own ability to make decisions, ahead of the value of life itself. We're valuing autonomy ahead of life. And that really is difficult to sustain, because, of course, you need life to be able to make an autonomous decision. So there are rational sort of arguments like that can be difficult to refute if you strip away the emotion from the argument. When we compare life to death, I come back to a book that by a philosopher called Philip Devine, who wrote a book on the ethics of homicide. And he had a section on what he called the logical opaqueness of death, which meant that we can value life, but we can know what life is, and that's why we value it, but we can't actually know what death is, because none of us have died and come back, and it was, except the miraculous situation of Christ. But for us, we can't make what he called a balanced or a rational decision to die, because we don't know both ends of the equation. We know what life is, but we don't know what death is. We could choose death because we have faith that something better is beyond, or we can choose death simply as a gamble that something would be better beyond. But we can't make a balanced or reasonable or rational decision. I think we've got to think that one through in terms of what we're doing when we choose to die. And in rational terms, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try to think we're making a balanced decision when in fact we don't know anything about what actually happens after life. Although we, as Christians, have a faith in that, but it's not the same necessarily as knowing. Now, as I said, euthanasia means that we're putting personal autonomy ahead of life itself in what we value. And I've mentioned that autonomy requires life, but you know, the arguments and the stories that are used to support euthanasia are always about balancing someone who has a very poor quality of life with dying, although dying was the only alternative. But the reality is that the opposite to a painful existence or a poor existence is not death. It's either a painless existence or a better life. So it's not as though the only alternative we have if things are going badly is to end our lives. It's actually, there's always an alternative to try and make life better. So it's not existence which is causing the need for choice, but the things that are compromising us enjoying our existence, like symptoms like pain or breathlessness or whatever. So I think that's an important point, because there are alternatives which may well be satisfactory if people know about them. And I think we'll come to this in a minute, but one of the important things, if you're going to talk about legislation for voluntary assisted death, do we know that everyone's going to have access to the appropriate counselling, to the appropriate palliative care? Well, I can tell you there's not many states in Australia where palliative care in a good sense extends beyond big urban centres. Sometimes in rural communities they struggle to access services like that, and yet instead of providing those services, we're talking about legislating to make it easy to die. But what makes life rich and so on? And I'd like to put forward the idea that the thing that makes a rich life is a life that has many options. And a poor life, due to illness or to poverty or whatever, is a life where the options are restricted. So it's still not an issue that death should be the opposite to a rich life, because death in fact forecloses all options to someone quite irrevocably, quite irreversibly. And so what are some of the options in the medical sense, which is where voluntary assisted death is to be applied? Well, palliative care relieves suffering. And it does that by using all sorts of other options other than death. And we're actually pretty good at it. I would estimate that about 95% of the symptoms that we see in various illnesses can be helped by palliative care. But the thing is that people don't always know what all their options are for a rich life. I mean, we concentrate on the physical, but there are all sorts of spiritual and emotional and relationship things that can make our life rich that have to be put into the balance as well. I think that a pastoral counsellor I used to know used to talk about euthanasia as tearing the last page out of a book. And the reason she did that, she said there's a lot of valuable things written on that last page, and you don't ever get to see the end of the novel of life's whole experience unless you are there to live it completely. And what the problem here is that most of the arguments about euthanasia are based on the physical, and it's not the physical that makes our lives rich. In the secular world, I used to always give the example of where pain can be, in fact, made secondary to something else. And I used to give the example of running a marathon where at about 35 kilometres there's this experience of hitting the wall, which is both a physical and psychological experience where basically everything hurts and you rather wish the whole thing was over. And I talked about it in the abstract till I actually ran the New York Marathon and subsequently the Melbourne Marathon and had that experience. But because, you know, the drive was to conquer one of athletics' great challenges, pain was something you accepted as part of it in order to push on and do something that you really want to do. Well, that's the issue here. Are there things that can make your life valuable even if you don't have complete control of your physical symptoms? If you're in the 5% where palliative care hasn't worked as well as it could have worked. And the fact is there are things that people can find in their life. And this is what the pastoral counsellors often do. Often there are unresolved relationship issues, and when people are relieved of the sort of physical, they can focus on them. Some people who have been busy doing things all of their life for the first time get a chance to focus on the spiritual. And so there are valuable things that can be pointed out to people about this, and what it means is that we're trying to help people to live life to the full, as John 10:10 says. We're not denying death, we're simply living to the full up until the time when inevitably we all will die. But there's a couple of other sort of arguments that I'd like to put that again, are devoid of emotion in that way, and that is, even if there was a very persuasive case that someone was suffering and nothing could be done to relieve their suffering or to make their life valuable, the question we have is, can you actually legislate to solve that problem? Because the problem is we very rarely in government legislate for a minority if the legislation could pose a threat to the majority. And what is that threat? Well, we live in an economically rationalist society. In other words, you know, economics seems to drive many of our decisions. I'm very pleased that in the early days of this COVID pandemic, economics got put to the background while we concentrated on making sure we saved a lot of the lives of our population by putting in lockdown laws and so on. But in general, that's been an exception to the usual situation where economic decisions rule. So the problem is, the threat is that there may be undue pressure put on people that are using valuable medical resources at the end of life to end it more quickly. And that would be quite unreasonable, because it's not based on a medical decision often, if in fact the value of their life is based on some of the other things, exploring spirituality and things that we've talked about. So we've got to be aware that legislation could be a very blunt instrument to try and allow a minority of people who are in a situation where they can't see their way out of it and they can't be helped to satisfy that aim. If people who did want to be live their life to the full but take up the resources at the end of life were compromised because of that. So we've got to be very careful in that situation. So I want to give a couple of cases that just illustrate these points, because I've tried to talk sort of rationally, but there are cases behind all of these things that help you to formulate your arguments and your position that would put a highest value on life. And one was the case of a woman that I looked after years ago who had widespread bowel cancer, and she came in and we gave her some chemotherapy, and she actually improved a lot and went back home to her 3 daughters and her job as working in a dress shop. And she had a good life for about 18 months, and then the disease recurred again despite the treatment, and she came back in and we treated her with an experimental treatment. And to our absolute delight, she responded again, but this time, unfortunately, only for about 6 months. And she came into hospital and she had very widespread disease into her liver and her lungs. And she was clearly, there was nothing more active we could do. And we were talking to her about symptom control, and she asked for euthanasia. And on the face of it, was a perfectly reasonable request. She said she talked it over with her family, and they all agreed that it would be time to do this. Now, we could have taken it at face value and not actually explored it any further, but we asked the woman why actually she wanted to die. And she told us, well, you know, I've been looking after my family for years. I can't do anything more for them, and therefore, you know, there's nothing more that I want to live for. But we also, she said, I'm afraid there's one other thing as well. She said, I'm actually afraid of the way I'm going to die, because I've got disease in my lungs, and I watched my father die of lung cancer, and he was breathless and he was distressed, and it was awful. So we explored with her those 2 things. And on the first, we absolutely assured her we could give her a comfortable death using opiates and so on to slow her breathing down and to make her comfortable. But on the other point, what she didn't realise is her youngest daughter was incredibly distressed, and she was very angry at us because we'd managed to fix her mother up on previous occasions, and we were abandoning things now. The fact that we didn't have anything more to do, she was incredibly angry, and she was literally screaming at nurses and everyone else. So I actually told the mother that she still did have something to do, and that's her daughter needed to spend more time with her. And the woman instantly withdrew her request for euthanasia, and she decided that she would like to be surrounded by her family. She died 5 days later, but in that 5 days, that daughter came to grips with her mother's death and had a far better grieving process than she would have otherwise. Now, if we'd just taken it on face value, you're allowed to die, you've asked to die, so we're going to do it, we would have missed out on a rich experience for her and a rich experience for her daughter. And I think that's the sort of thing that we've got to be very careful of here in trying to make a blunt instrument deal with these sort of subtleties. And other people have given cases like, I remember giving a talk one time at a church, and they said, oh, there's a woman in a nursing home who used to be the pillar of the church, you know, the type. She played the organ, she taught Sunday school, she did everything. And then she became seriously ill and demented, and now she's rocking away in a nursing home. Surely that's the case for euthanasia. Well, the thing here is that just because someone's life isn't the same as it was before, does that mean they deserve to die? What about if she, as long as she was fed and warm and comfortable, she was actually quite content rocking away and perhaps reliving old memories or whatever? Why could we make a judgment that because she was no longer the pillar of the church, that meant she deserved to die? And it's where I want to end this, because both of those cases illustrate one thing that I think we need to learn. We need to learn it before we die, and that is this, that we are valued for who we are, not just what we do. And in both of those cases, the woman with the bowel cancer thought that once she couldn't look after her family, do the washing, the cleaning and the rest of it, and go to work and provide and so on, that there was nothing more that they valued her for. And yet when you talk to the family, they just wanted to be with her. And indeed the same thing, it's the people are valued for who they are, and we've got to learn that lesson during life and not when we're faced with end-of-life decisions. So I'd like to end up and leave you with that very strong message that you're valued for who you are, that you've got a life that will have its ups and downs, but the fact is it's about the richness of life, that we experience it right to the end, and then we get to experience what in faith we might find out what happens after death. And so I'd like to leave you with those type of arguments to explore, and so you're able to discuss with others why you believe that voluntary assisted death or euthanasia should not be legislated for.